The year was 1944. Across the burning fields of Europe, the once proud German war machine was breaking apart. Cities lay in ruins, hospitals overflowed, and the desperate cries of the wounded echoed through corridors soaked with the smell of antiseptic and fear. Among those trying to hold the crumbling front lines together were not soldiers, but women. Young German nurses, trained to serve the Reich, yet burdened by a duty far greater than politics. When Allied forces advanced through Western Europe, many of these nurses were captured, not as fighters, but as witnesses of a collapsing empire. They were women of compassion trapped in a war of destruction. Some expected punishment, others humiliation. None imagined they would soon find themselves thousands of miles away, in the very heart of America. Transported across the Atlantic under strict military escort, they were taken not to prisons, but to hospitals, U.S. military facilities where they were treated not as enemies, but as human beings. What awaited them there would defy everything they had been taught about the so-called enemy. These women, raised in the ideology of superiority and fear, were about to seek kindness from those they thought of as monsters. And in those hospital corridors, lined with American doctors, white sheets, and the smell of coffee instead of gunpowder, their worldviews would shatter. This is the untold story of captured German nurses sent. The year was nearing its end, 1944, a time when the once unstoppable German war effort was collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. Across the battle-scarred landscapes of France and Belgium, the air smelled of smoke and sorrow. Towns that once bustled with life now stood in eerie silence, their ruins echoing with the distant thunder of artillery. Amid the chaos, a small group of German nurses worked tirelessly inside what remained of a field hospital. The tents trembled with each nearby explosion, but their hands did not. They moved through the wounded with quiet determination, faces pale, uniforms smeared with blood, their eyes reflecting exhaustion deeper than words could describe. For months they had lived like ghosts, drifting between war fronts, saving lives that often faded in their arms. Many of them were barely in their 20s, women who had once dreamed of calm homes and quiet gardens, now kneeling on mud-soaked ground beside dying men. Their faith was no longer in victory but in survival. Yet, even in defeat, they carried out their duty, to care, to comfort, to heal, even when healing seemed impossible. When the rumble of Allied tanks approached the outskirts of the village that day, no one ran. The nurses could hear it, the metallic growl drawing closer, the sounds of shouting in English, the unmistakable rhythm of boots hitting earth. Some of the wounded cried out in panic, fearing what would come next. But the nurses stayed. They moved between the rows of stretchers, whispering to the soldiers that it would be all right, even though they didn't believe it themselves. Moments later, the canvas flaps of the tent were pulled aside. A column of American and British soldiers appeared, helmets glinting, rifles raised. The nurses froze, their white aprons stained crimson. For a moment, time seemed to hold its breath. The Allied officer in front scanned the scene, expecting resistance, perhaps an ambush. But what he saw instead stopped him cold. Not soldiers, but women surrounded by the dying. One of them, her hands still pressed against a soldier's bandaged chest, looked up at him with a mixture of fear and defiance. There was no gunfire, no shouting, only silence. Then the officer gave a quiet order, and the rifles lowered. The Americans began moving through the tent, checking for hidden weapons, but what they found were only bandages, scalpels, and trembling hands. One by one, the nurses were gathered together outside, their faces pale under the grey European sky. They stood beside the tattered remnants of their hospital, a row of makeshift cots and blood-stained blankets fluttering in the wind. To their surprise, no one struck them, no one spat on them. Instead, the soldiers simply watched them with quiet, unreadable expressions. The nurses were told they were now prisoners of war. The words hung heavy in the air. To them, it meant an uncertain fate. Perhaps interrogation, perhaps shame, or perhaps something worse. Yet, as the hours passed, something strange unfolded. The Allied soldiers brought them food, real food. Not the thin broth they'd been living on. They even offered cigarettes, though most of the nurses refused. It wasn't kindness they understood yet. It was confusion. As the days turned into a blur of marching and transport, the nurses found themselves herded into a convoy of trucks heading west. The landscape rolled by, shattered farms, burned-out vehicles, scattered ruins that once were villages. None of them spoke. They had sworn oaths to heal the wounded of Germany, not to fall into enemy hands. Yet here they were, powerless, stripped of their authority, carrying only the medical kits that had been their lifelines. At a temporary holding camp near Cherbourg, they learned the truth. They were not to remain in Europe. They were to be sent across the ocean. The word spread like wildfire among the captured. America. To most of them, it sounded like a death sentence. America was the enemy, the monster that rained fire from the skies. Propaganda had painted it as a land of greed and cruelty, a place where captured Germans would be paraded, humiliated, or worse. That night, as the camp grew quiet and the stars emerged, the nurses sat together by a dim lantern, whispering their fears. Some cried quietly, thinking of home, of mothers and brothers they might never see again. Others stared into the dark, too numb to speak. One nurse, her name Anna, clutched a small rosary she had kept hidden throughout the war. Her hands trembled as she prayed, not for victory, but for mercy. Days later, under strict guard, they were marched toward the docks. The harbor was alive with movement, ships, soldiers, crates, and the low hum of engines preparing to cross the Atlantic. The nurses, still wearing their faded uniforms, were escorted onto a transport ship marked with the insignia of the U.S. Army. The smell of salt filled the air, mingling with diesel and the faint scent of tobacco. As they stepped onto the gangway, the nurses looked back one last time at the European shore, their homeland disappearing behind them, swallowed by the fog of war. The sea stretched before them like an endless grey expanse, indifferent to their fear. Once aboard, they were led below deck, where makeshift bunks and narrow corridors awaited. The sound of creaking metal and distant waves became their new lullaby. During the voyage, days bled into one another. The nurses spoke little, each lost in her own thoughts. The Americans on board treated them with a kind of distant professionalism. Not warmth, but not hatred either. Meals were served at regular intervals, simple and filling. The nurses, used to scarcity, ate quietly, unable to decide whether to be grateful or suspicious. Sometimes, they were allowed on deck under supervision. Standing there, with the cold Atlantic wind whipping through their hair, they watched the horizon, nothing but blue water meeting grey sky. Some imagined submarines lurking beneath, ready to sink them all. Others thought of home again. The streets of Berlin, the forests of Bavaria, the laughter of loved ones long gone. One night, a storm struck. The waves rose like black walls, crashing against the hull with terrifying force. The ship groaned and tilted violently. throwing some of the women from their bunks. Panic rippled through the lower decks, not from battle, but from nature itself. In the chaos, an American medic came running through the passageway, shouting for calm. He found several of the nurses trying to help others who were seasick or injured from the fall. Even in captivity, their instincts as healers had taken over. When morning came, the sea was calm again. The nurses stood silently on deck, staring at the sun breaking through the clouds. For the first time in weeks, some of them smiled faintly, not from joy but from sheer relief. As the days went on, subtle moments began to chip away at their fears. An American officer offered one of them his coat when she shivered in the cold. Another brought them tea instead of water. These small acts of decency clashed violently with the image they had been taught. The enemy was supposed to be cruel, heartless, savage. But here, aboard this steel vessel in the middle of the ocean, kindness existed. The ship's horn let out a long, echoing cry as it docked at the American harbor. The German nurses, weary from the weeks-long voyage, stood in a silent line along the deck, staring out at the coastline that shimmered beneath the morning sun. America, the enemy they had feared, the land they had been told was ruthless and unforgiving, now stretched before them calm and clean, like a dream they couldn't quite believe was real. The air smelled of salt and industry, but beneath that was something gentler, fresher. The skyline was alive with motion. Cranes, trucks, uniforms, but there was no sign of chaos, no ruins, no smoke, no war. They were led down the gangway, guarded but not mistreated. The dock workers paused to watch as the convoy of captured German nurses stepped onto American soil for the first time. Some whispered to each other, others simply stared. The nurses, clutching their small satchels, walked with stiff dignity, their minds racing. They expected the humiliation to begin. Jeers, perhaps spitting, perhaps the flash of cameras for newspapers that would show them off like trophies. But none of that came. Instead, an American officer approached, clipboard in hand, his tone brisk but respectful. He ordered his men to assist the women with their luggage. One soldier offered to carry a bag. The nurse hesitated, unsure whether it was a trick. Then, after a long pause, she handed it to him, cautiously, like passing an offering to fate itself. They were directed into military trucks, their engines humming softly in the cool morning air. The convoy began its slow journey through the port city, past streets lined with shops and clean sidewalks, past children laughing and waving small flags. The nurses didn't wave back. They were too stunned. How could this be the enemy's home? These people didn't look starved or broken. They weren't haunted by bomb sirens or trench mud. They looked alive. Hours later, the convoy reached its destination, a sprawling medical facility that stood like a cathedral of glass and steel. The sign at the entrance read U.S. Army Medical Corps Hospital No. 214. The nurses stared in disbelief. This was not a prison. It was beautiful. The lawns were trimmed. The walls gleamed in the sunlight, and a large American flag waved gently in the breeze above the building. They had expected barbed wire, shouting guards, and barred windows. Instead, they were greeted by doctors in white coats, Red Cross workers, and nurses who smiled, genuinely smiled, as the group approached. Inside, the contrast hit them even harder. The corridors were spotless. The air smelled of disinfectant, and something foreign yet comforting, coffee. The sound of footsteps echoed softly over polished floors. Some of the German nurses couldn't look up. The shame of being captives overwhelmed them. Others glanced around, eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and fear. The American doctors didn't sneer, didn't mock. They simply began assigning rooms and conducting medical examinations, treating the newcomers as if they were colleagues rather than prisoners. When one nurse fainted from exhaustion, an American orderly caught her before she hit the ground. Another brought her water, gently placing a hand on her shoulder.
"You're safe now?"
he said quietly. The words didn't register at first. Safe? She didn't even know what that meant anymore. In Europe, the word had lost its meaning long ago. Each nurse was shown to a room, small, simple, but impossibly clean. White sheets, a window, a lamp, even a vase with flowers. One woman stood frozen at the sight of the bed, whispering under her breath that she hadn't seen one so clean since 1939. Another touched the pillow, almost afraid to dirty it. That first night, they were served a meal that brought tears to their eyes. Bread, butter, stew with real meat, and a cup of hot coffee. None of them had tasted such food in years. At first, they didn't eat. Some thought it might be poisoned, a cruel trick. But when the Americans sat nearby, eating the same meal without hesitation, hunger won over suspicion. Slowly, one by one, they began to eat. The flavor was overwhelming. Several nurses wept silently as they swallowed each bite, their minds caught between gratitude and disbelief. The next morning, they were escorted to the hospital wards, where the true shock began. Instead of being kept isolated, many of the German nurses were asked to assist in medical work. Not as prisoners forced to labor, but as trained professionals. American doctors seemed genuinely interested in their skills. One doctor, a man in his 40s with calm blue eyes, handed a nurse a set of gloves and asked if she would help sterilize instruments. She hesitated, unsure if she was allowed to refuse. "Only if you're comfortable," he said gently. The tone disarmed her. She nodded. By the end of the day, several of them had been assigned to help treat wounded Allied soldiers, men who had fought against their own army only weeks before. The nurses expected anger, taunts, maybe even violence. But what they saw instead was humanity. Many of the wounded men, too weak or tired to care about politics, simply accepted the care in silence. Some even managed a faint thank you. The German nurses were not prepared for this. For years, they had been taught that the Americans were brutal and arrogant. That capture meant humiliation. They were told they would be treated as less than human. But here, in this hospital, they were being treated with a kind of respect that unsettled them. It was as though the Americans saw through the war, saw only the people beneath the uniforms. In the evenings, they were allowed to walk in the courtyard. Guards were present, but they kept their distance. The air was warm, filled with the hum of crickets and the scent of freshly cut grass. Some of the nurses sat on benches, watching the sunset. Others looked toward the horizon, wondering how far home was, and if anyone there even knew they were alive. Days turned to weeks. Slowly, the fear began to fade. The nurses started to talk with their American counterparts. Simple words at first, about procedures, supplies, or patients. Then, as the ice melted, they spoke of families, of how long the war had lasted, of the things they had lost. The American nurses listened without judgment. For the first time, the Germans realized that kindness could exist without agenda. There was one moment, small but unforgettable. A young German nurse named Elise was struggling to lift a wounded soldier during a transfer. An American nurse hurried over to help. Together they worked silently side by side, moving the patient with practiced care. When it was done, Elise turned to her. expecting perhaps a cold nod or perfunctory smile. Instead, the American woman extended her hand. "You did well," she said. Elise hesitated, then took the hand. That handshake, brief, awkward, human, broke through something inside her that no propaganda could ever repair. The shock wasn't in the comfort of the hospital or the food on the table. The real shock was moral. These women had been raised in a world that glorified division, where kindness was weakness and mercy was betrayal. Yet here they were, being shown both without question. The Americans had nothing to gain from treating them well. That realization gnawed at them, leaving them both grateful and ashamed. In letters they were allowed to write, heavily censored. Of course, some of the nurses described their experience in vague terms. "We are being treated kindly," one wrote. "Far better than we expected," another said simply. "It is strange. They do not hate us." The irony wasn't lost on them in the land of their enemy. The first days inside the American hospital had been filled with confusion and disbelief. But now, weeks later, something unexpected was happening. The German nurses who had once feared every shadow, every uniform, began to settle into a quiet rhythm of life. The war outside still raged across oceans and continents, but within these hospital walls, the chaos of the world felt distant, replaced by the soft rustle of papers, the hum of machines, and the rhythm of footsteps echoing down polished corridors. At first, the nurses worked mechanically. They obeyed instructions, kept their heads lowered, and spoke only when addressed. It was easier that way. Easier not to think, not to feel, not to wonder why their captors treated them as equals. But soon, duty took over instinct. Healing was in their blood, and when faced with the wounded, that instinct drowned out every trace of suspicion or pride. They began to work with purpose again, cleaning wounds, monitoring patients, organizing medicine, actions that came as naturally as breathing. Only now, the patients they treated were Americans. It was an impossible contradiction. These were the men who had bombed their cities, who had marched through the villages they once called home. Yet, as they cleaned bandages and offered water to trembling lips, the nurses couldn't help but see them for what they truly were. Boys, not monsters. Young men no older than their brothers, broken by the same war that had broken them. Some whispered prayers in English, others just stared into nothingness, haunted by things no language could express. One morning, a German nurse named Ingrid was assigned to the recovery wing. She hesitated when she saw the chart. An American lieutenant, badly burned. His condition critical. For a long moment, she stood frozen outside his room, heart pounding. When she finally entered, she found him unconscious. His face bandaged, his breathing shallow. The machines beside him ticked like a metronome of survival. She worked in silence, replacing dressings, checking his pulse. It wasn't until she reached for a new roll of gauze that she realized his dog tags were still around his neck. She read the name. It meant nothing to her, but something about it struck deep. It was a name like any other, a name that could have belonged to anyone. To a friend, to a son, to someone who once laughed before the world turned cruel. In the days that followed, she returned to his bedside again and again. She didn't speak, but she stayed, ensuring his bandages were clean and his vitals steady. When he finally opened his eyes for the first time, they were cloudy with confusion. He stared at her uniform, then at her face. For a moment, she thought he would shout, that anger would fill the room. But instead, he whispered, his voice raw. "Are you German?" She nodded slowly. His eyes widened, and then he simply closed them again. A single tear rolled down the side of his face. That night, Ingrid couldn't sleep. The image of the soldier haunted her. She realized something she had never dared to before. That kindness given to an enemy was perhaps the purest form of healing. From then on, she didn't see him as a symbol of war, but as another human being caught in the same storm. The same transformation began to ripple through the others. Across the wards, American and German nurses began working side by side. They learned to communicate through gestures, nods, and broken English. The Americans were curious about their European counterparts. The discipline, the precision, the quiet grace with which they moved. The Germans, in turn, were astonished by the openness of their American peers, the laughter, the unguarded warmth, the way they called each other by first names instead of ranks. One afternoon, during a lull in the day's chaos, a small moment unfolded that none of them would forget. An American nurse dropped a tray of instruments, the metallic clang echoing sharply through the hall. Instinctively, a German nurse rushed forward to help. Kneeling beside her as they gathered the scattered tools, their hands brushed, and they both froze. A shared embarrassment, then a quiet laugh. It was nothing, a flicker of humanity. But in a place once divided by flags and fear, that small sound meant everything. The doctors noticed the change. The hostility that once lingered had begun to fade. Even the guards relaxed. Where once there had been cold silence, now there was conversation. It wasn't unusual anymore to hear an American nurse asking how to pronounce a German word, or to see one of the Germans trying to understand a medical term in English. The war was still real, but not here, not in this hospital. Then came the letters. Each week the nurses were allowed to write one letter home. Paper, pen, and a faint hope that their words would make it across the ocean. They weren't allowed to mention their location or details of their surroundings, but they found ways to express what they felt. "We are safe," one wrote carefully. "They are not what we were told." Another wrote, "They treat us as people, not enemies. It feels wrong to be grateful, but I am." For many of them, these letters were confessions, quiet admissions that the world wasn't as black and white as they had once believed. As winter came, snow began to fall outside the hospital grounds. The German nurses stood by the windows, watching the white flakes settle on the lawns and trees. One of them whispered that it reminded her of home, of the forests in Bavaria before the war. An American nurse standing nearby heard her and smiled. That evening, she surprised the group by bringing them cups of hot chocolate from the mess hall. It was such a small act, yet it carried a warmth that went deeper than the drink itself. In time, some of the German nurses were assigned to assist with the rehabilitation wing, soldiers learning to walk again, to move again, to live again. There, they saw the true toll of war. Men missing limbs, blinded by shrapnel, haunted by nightmares that medicine couldn't cure. The nurses did what they could, not just with medicine, but with presence. They listened, they spoke softly. They reminded these men, both American and German, that life still existed beyond pain. The American doctors often observed their dedication in silence. "They're remarkable," one said one evening in the staff lounge. "They've seen too much suffering to hate anyone anymore." Another nodded. "War burns the hate out of people like that. What's left is something purer." There were moments of heartbreak, too. One day, news arrived that Germany had suffered a major defeat. Some of the nurses broke down in tears. not because they wanted their country to win, but because it meant the world they knew, flawed as it was, had finally shattered. An American nurse sat beside one of them, saying nothing, only placing a hand on her back. No words were needed. Compassion had its own language. By the time spring arrived, the transformation was complete. The German nurses were no longer seen as captives. They were part of the hospital, quiet, diligent, respected. They were still watched, of course, still bound by rules, but those rules had softened. They were invited to meals, to small staff gatherings, even to church services. For women who had once expected humiliation, this acceptance felt surreal. Some began to talk about what would happen after the war. Would they be sent home? Would anyone believe their stories? Would anyone understand that in the heart of the enemy's land, they had found not vengeance, but mercy? One nurse said softly, "If I tell them how we were treated, they'll think I'm lying." And perhaps she was right. In the months that followed, rumors spread among them, whispers that their good behavior and service might shorten their captivity. But for most, that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what they had learned. The war had stripped them of everything: homeland, faith, certainty. Yet here, in this foreign place, they had been given something greater in return: understanding. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, the nurses gathered in the hospital courtyard. The sky burned orange and gold, and the flag above the building stirred gently in the breeze. No one spoke for a long time. Then, one of the Americans broke the silence, turning to a German nurse beside her. "Do you think we'll ever forget all this?" she asked quietly. The German smiled faintly. "I hope not," she said, "because forgetting means it could happen again." When the war finally ended, the news came with both relief and sorrow. Some of the nurses cried openly. They would soon be repatriated, returned to a homeland in ruins, where cities lay in ashes and families were scattered. Yet part of them didn't want to leave. America had become something more than a place. It had become a symbol of what the world could be when compassion triumphed over vengeance. Before they departed, the American hospital staff gathered to bid them farewell. There were handshakes, tears, even a few embraces. One doctor pressed a small folded note into a nurse's hand. It read, "You were our guests, not our prisoners. May peace find you." As their transport rolled away, the nurses looked back at the hospital one last time. Through the windows, they could see familiar faces: American doctors, Red Cross workers, and fellow nurses waving goodbye. In their hearts, something had changed forever. They had come to America as captives, expecting cruelty, prepared for humiliation, but they were leaving with something